Welcome back, dear viewers. This review and discussion took a little bit. I put it off last week so I could rush out my video on what makes a great superhero costume on screen and diving into the reveal of the new Superman Legacy costume. But I had to come back to X-Men 97. Like the moth drawn back to that bright blue bug zapper in the backyard over the patio, I had to try and understand it. What are these writers driving towards? What are their goals? Where is this going? Beyond tossing massive storylines from the comics with completely different writing structures, goals, and tones all into a blender and cranking the dial to 11, I had to try and understand. And I think, now with episode 8, I at last see the overall picture. It's a picture of scrambled crayon, ink, and paste with a little old spaghetti thrown all over it, but I see it. So where is this rushed, bizarre narrative with its tonal inconsistency, its grade school dialogue, and its not-so-hidden messaging going? Well, basically, Magneto is the bad guy, and the X-Men need to stop him. You know, the storyline that's been the same for the last 35-ish years of X-Men stories? You thought the show was going somewhere different? No, we're right back where we were. See, I gave the writers too much credit, thinking they were wanting to adapt Grant Morrison's new X-Men. That was when I thought they were trying to marry Magneto's redemption arc with his descent into madness and addiction that Morrison explored. Now, while love it or hate it, moving the narrative forward on the X-Men into a new era was at least a good instinct. I thought the writers of this show were going to start us off in the comfortable world resembling the X-Men we knew from the animated series. And then, in the not-so-subtle ways that Disney has these days, hammer those characters and the team at large into the story Morrison told by the end. That would not have been good either, but it at least would have made some sense. Again, that was giving them too much credit. These writers apparently are fixated on the Lobdell era of the X-Men and some of the worst plotlines ever told in X-Men comics. Thank God they're at least not fans of the Chuck Austen era. So without further ado, let's get into the plot breakdown. Special note, for this episode, I'm going to be dispensing with the trailer voice that I was trying out in the previous ones. It's just too much. And honestly, this one is so problematic. I feel like episode 9's breakdown is going to be much shorter in comparison because that's pretty straightforward. This just, there's so many things to go over here. But anyway, we open with Cable shooting bottles out in the backyard of the X-Mansion. I don't really have a specific criticism about this, except to say it's such a cliched, what do people with guns do? I know, they shoot bottles. That it's just, what is it, Deadpool?
Well, that's just lazy writing.
Scott talks about him with Jean. It's the same hackneyed, overwrought stuff they've been saying. We then go to the scene that should have opened the episode with Cable explaining the threat and what Bastion wants. Bastion has apparently taken the techno-organic virus and mutated it so that he can turn the world into human hybrid sentinels. The show does its normal thing now where a character will throw out random lines and explanations so fast you barely have time to register what they said before we've moved on to the next thing they're saying. In this case, it's that Cable had an insider in Bastion's inner circle that gave him information in the future on Bastion in the past. There's no mention of who, what they told him, why they only told him some things and not others, and why they know anything at all. So, in essence, the show is saying,
Don't think about it.
Cable also says that he's tried to stop Genosha an untold number of times, but always gets pulled away before he can change it. Beast says something about the mystics at Camartage, speaking of fixed moments in time.
Don't think about it.
Finally, the news breaks in that Bastion released the footage of Xavier across the galaxy being coronated in the throne room of the Shi'ar effing Empire. How did Bastion get this footage? Is it real time? Why would the news assume this was real? What world are we in? Is this a universe from the 92 cartoons or the MCU since they have Doctor Strange magic and mention Camartage? Why would the public care that Xavier is alive? Why would they believe this wasn't some bizarre hoax? Is Xavier famous enough that the average person would care? Who are the X-Men to the country? To the US government? Are they still covert? Are they working with the government? I know they were slowly rolling themselves out to the public, but we barely got any of that. Are the X-Men popular in the public? Would the government or Kelly not have reached out and said, "What the hell, guys?" I know.
Think about it.
We're cut from that scene over to Sunspot and Jubilee with Sunspot's mother in Brazil. The TV news has William Stryker spouting conjecture that Xavier will return from space with an alien army, in very Hannity and Combs style. Sunspot's mother, who the show is determined to make evil, says that she is putting together a fundraiser for the victims of the Genosha attack. She correctly points out that the X-Men are not doing much to help, and Jubilee, who up until this point had escaped the show's gravitational pull of character destruction, suddenly becomes an insufferable SJW and tells Sunspot's mother, who is housing and feeding her, that the X-Men are always too busy protecting the professor from you people. Sunspot's mother reacts with an actual appropriate amount of disbelief and comes back in a fairly calm manner, considering the little brat her son brought home is insulting her to her face in her own home as she eats at her table. Jubilee then storms out, saying that they will use Sunspot's trust fund so that she can shop. Okay, so I have to stop here for a moment. We have officially reached the point with modern writing where I can no longer tell when the writers mean for a character like Jubilee to be insufferable and when they genuinely are so out of touch that they think this is a sympathetic character. If I were being generous towards them, I would possibly assume that Jubilee's behavior here was some sort of meta-commentary on who we should be angry at in society. But given the choice made later with Sunspot's mother, no, I think these writers think that having Jubilee act like an inept little protester, lashing out at the people trying their best to help as much as they can, is the best approach. And let's review Sunspot's mom for a moment. When he showed up with a strange girl in tow and outed himself as a mutant, did she scream, pull her hair, go into histrionics, or even just order Jubilee out of the room? No. Actually, I'd say she handled the whole thing pretty well. She accepted his abilities and made him aware that she was always aware of them and okay with it. Her only request was that he not be public with his place in society as a mutant, because she was aware that it might cause instability in their business. I know what this show is trying to do. It is trying to create a one-to-one correlation between the idea of Rodrigo being homosexual and him being a mutant. The issue with that, as shown extremely explicitly by the end of this episode, is that those are not one-to-one correlations. Any particular sexual orientation, I suppose, can still be a burden, although given my own in-family experiences with that, it has not been something I've seen greatly resented despite what Hollywood wants to portray. In the calm, mostly southern United States I've lived most of my life, being gay, bi, or trans has always been greeted mostly openly and with acceptance, if not indifference. On the other hand, if, say, you were to carry a gun with no safety and hand it off to an inexperienced teenager, not so much. And to be clear, that is the better correlation with mutant abilities. Most mutants, especially those we champion on the show, have deadly abilities akin to them carrying around an AK-47 at all times that could kill dozens of people in their immediate vicinity. Sunspot, just to remember, literally channels the energy of the sun. He can fly, he can create great amounts of heat, and he has super strength that we're shown by the end of this episode he is not in control of. So, this is essentially like a kid saying, "Hey, I have a bomb vest that's always strapped to me that I really don't know how to work yet." So it's a little understandable why his mother would say, "Hey, maybe we just keep this one in family for right now. I'm okay that this is what you are, but we need to be a little careful about this." I know they want to make her a bad guy, but this is not how you do that. We cut back to the mansion where Nightcrawler and Jean are caring for Rogue while she's in a coma. I don't have much to say on the scene beyond it being another bit of bizarre characterization for Jean, with her fretting over whether or not she can acknowledge Cable as her blood and reconcile her memories of carrying and birthing Nathan with the reality that it was Madeline. This was not an issue in the stories it was based on because Claremont and Simonson knew who Jean was and understood that after merging her mind with Madeline's, she would love and protect Nathan to the utmost. But it does give us some actually well-written dialogue from Nightcrawler, and dare I say it, some genuinely moving words about memories and what they mean to us. No snark, well done show. You can do Nightcrawler pretty well. Then, Jean, Cable, and Scott go to find Bastion's home base. Cable mentions his contact only having vague information on where it is.
Think about it.
Meanwhile, at the Legion of Doom, or, wherever Sinister and Bastion are hiding, we cut to Val Cooper being revealed to be working with Sinister and Bastion. We get bondage gear Magneto strung up on the wall. We get no real information on when Val Cooper began this arrangement, but she's wearing the Empire uniform. That means she's part of the team. We get a little commentary from Sinister clarifying that he's only with Bastion because it means for him he can add pins and mutants to experiment on. So we get more about what Sinister's true motives are. I was bothered by the fact that he was working with Bastion, but this at least explains it, and it is more in line with the Sinister from the comics. We then go back to the mansion. We're in Beast's lab. Trish Tilby brings Beast hot cocoa. There's something suspicious about it right off the bat. I wonder what that could be. Beast is keeping Trask in stasis and reveals he can discover who all of the other Sentinels are and track them through Trask. Cyclops, Jean, and Cable find Bastion's childhood home in Ohio, and this is where the show starts going off the rails for me. They find Bastion's mother sitting in a dark room with a flickering light next to her. Now, maybe in and of itself not so bad, but here's the deal. They know Bastion can create human hybrid Sentinels. The woman literally says he left her there for them. They think nothing of this and leave her to pack and go up to Bastion's childhood room. Cable, the man who came back from the future, who knows everything Bastion and the Prime Sentinels are capable of, how evil and insidious they are, after seeing the creepy old woman sitting in the dark beside a flickering lamp, just says, "Play along."
Jesus.
Upstairs, Jean suddenly becomes an exposition machine after touching one of Bastion's childhood drawings so that we get Bastion's backstory summed up for us. Apparently, his dad was a school janitor, not a businessman, not a firefighter, a welder, or even, dare I suggest it as a male teacher myself, a male teacher? The show could have actually been progressive and shown a white man, and I'm saying that because Bastion is made oh so white, teaching a classroom, smiling, and enjoying his job. In horror movie fashion, you could have shown the blob of goo dropping on him and merging with him, showing the insidiousness of this creature, that evil can come from anywhere. But no, Bastion's dad was specifically a janitor at a school. I really don't know what they are trying to convey here because Jean says this specifically. But working in education myself for the last 6 years, I can, however, tell the writers and anyone else concerned with getting titles and names right that this is actually called facilities management these days, and they have a very hard and broad spectrum job across an entire campus. They're not just janitors. But hey, good job, writers. Anyway, exposition machine Jean reveals that Bastion's school janitor dad was mopping one day in a storeroom, and even though there was a giant pink glowing puddle of ooze sliding across the floor to him, he didn't notice it. He didn't notice it when it went up his leg, in very blob-like fashion, all the way up his pants, through his shirt, and then went into his ear. Apparently he stood completely still for all of that. Somehow it merged with him, and when he and Bastion's mother got together, they created Bastion, the descendant of every Sentinel past, present, and future. How did this goo get there? Where did it come from? When did it come from? Why target this guy in this particular Ohio town? Why be in a school? In my last episode breakdown, I went through the whole complicated history for Bastion that involved giant robots being thrown through a magical portal and somehow creating Bastion, so I get it. The writers needed something different, so they went as vague as possible. And as always, on this show, when in doubt, say it fast, move on to the next thing, and most importantly,
Think about it.
back in the glowing pink monitor room, Bastion is confronted by Val Cooper and Doom and Zemo over his attack on Genosha. He explains his plan as carry out a massive terrorist attack on Genosha and mutants to overload the bandwidth of humanity, causing them to feel like mutants will want to go to war with humans so that humans will go to war with mutants and be willing to have themselves augmented by Sentinel tech. Doom, being a part of this, feels extremely out of character for the proud leader of his own autonomous nation. So, would Doom risk his own control and power in his own nation to be a part of this plan? Most likely not. But, as always with this show,
Think about it.
This next scene, man. For all the people claiming that Disney left the overly woke messaging out of this, I would submit this scene as a counter-argument. You see, Bastion, as all dastardly villains do, explains the rest of his plan to Val Cooper. We are shown his creepy Frankenstein's laboratory with glowing Rick and Morty tanks of green goo that somehow create the Prime Sentinel hybrids. Sinister is running it all as we zoom in on our primary example of who is volunteering for this program. And of course, it's a mulleted white guy with a Joe Dirt mustache they even call Joe. It is so ridiculously aimed at one group that it's almost farcical. Much like the Jubilee as SJW scene, if it weren't followed by later scenes doubling down on the messaging, I would think this was an Austin Powers-inspired joke pointing out this kind of one-sided demonizing. But no. Apparently, the people opting in for this process are incels coming from dial-up chat rooms. Which is just a hilarious idea for anyone who grew up in the era of dial-up internet and early chat rooms. But apparently these people are submitting for this process due to mutants displacing them as a labor force, or possibly coming onto them in a dive bar. So, again, mutant now just means either minority or gay. Cutting back to Jean, Cable, and Cyclops, they stand there like planks of wood as Bastion's mom comes in to have her horror movie scene revealing herself to be a human Sentinel hybrid. Shocking. Although the very Evil Dead visuals were not bad, and after all the horrible setup, we finally get to mindless action. Back in a mall in Brazil, Jubilee continues to be the most insufferable in the episode. She's using her new sugar daddy Sunspot to buy herself a black leather onesie. Okay. Oh look, Sunspot's butler activates as a Sentinel. Now we get it. The Sentinel activation scene. And who is activated as a Sentinel? Well, a white woman checking her mail, a white group of men at a nighttime barbecue drinking beer, a white husband and wife happily watching TV with their small children and baby, and Trish Tilby, who is, what is she again? Oh, right. White. Back in the mansion, Trish Tilby beats up Beast, spouting normal villain dialogue about mutants no longer being Mother Nature's favorite, stating that humans were being told to face the mutants' future. Tilby kicks Beast into the common room where Nightcrawler, Morph, and Wolverine are. There's a decent on-the-nose joke from Wolverine about Beast's taste in women. Cut back to Cable, Cyclops, and Jean, where we discover that Bastion has turned his entire hometown into hybrid Sentinels. How? When? With whose authority? No. What's the rule on this show?
Don't think about it.
Cut back to the mansion, and the show continues doing something with Morph that is becoming a bit of an issue, having him take the form of Juggernaut. Something that should not be able to happen with his power set and could potentially be explained, but the next episode makes this even muddier. But swords fall on the ground by Nightcrawler, leading to the one really cool moment of the show so far. Cut back to Jubilee, who has dialogue that's about Velma level. They run away through the mall, and in a mall in Brazil, every single person has been turned into a hybrid Sentinel. We cut back to outside the mansion, where, oh boy, a crowd of protesters are gathered. In the crowd, every single person who is clearly, white, becomes a Sentinel. The only people who don't are the people drawn to look like minorities. So out of a group of radicalized humans, the most radicalized are, of course, the white people. It's not the way it used to be in the comics or in the old cartoons, wherein a person of any nationality or race could be anti-mutant, because that message had some deeper meaning. The original message was that hate and bigotry could grow in any group against any othered subset. But now in this show, it's mainly the white people everyone has to worry about. And now, thankfully, we get the one really good scene in this show. Wolverine attacks Trish Tilby because the show finally remembered he existed to be more than a callback. The Sentinels are closing in on Rogue, and we get Wolverine and Nightcrawler versus the Sentinels. The saddest thing about the show is how genuinely cool they make Nightcrawler here, and how much I wish the show had tried to respect other classic characters at this level. Nightcrawler here is everything about his comics counterpart that makes him a fan favorite, and the animation is the best of the series in this scene. So, again, no snark, no judgment from me, just a good scene. Back in Brazil, though, we find out Sunspot can fly. Okay. Then, back to Cyclops, Cable, and Jean. They're escaping in the Blackbird, the Sentinels are all around the plane trying to bring it down. There's okay banter between Jean and Cable, although considering the dialogue earlier, it's a little out of character for Jean. They escape in Cyclops' Porsche out of the plane, and Jerry Smith, I mean Cyclops.
Okay, let's show these toasters why you don't screw at the Summers.
No, I'm Mr. Crowbar, and this is my friend, who is also a crowbar.
That's stupid.
Leads the group through the battle. Then, back in Brazil, Sunspot and Jubilee crash his mother's gala. And I mean this literally, they crash through the window into the middle of the gala. And this is another of those scenes where, if it weren't for this show trying to be so mature, I'd think this was base level Saturday morning cartoon writing. Sunspot and Jubilee, again, literally crash into the window into the middle of his mother's gala. Sunspot says that the Sentinels are trying to kill him as they fly through the window. Now, of course, everybody in the party is more shocked by the two scared mutant kids that just crashed on the floor and not the two Evil Dead looking robots with glowing eyes that are veined out and just appeared in their window. And so what happens next? The two creepy as hell, deadite looking hybrid Sentinels with blasters for hands that literally chased her son through a window into her own home say that they are not trying to kill him, but are authorized to arrest him. Authorized by who? Under what authority? And even if they were, they're in Roberto's home, literally in front of his mother. But see, now publicly, Sunspot has been outed as a mutant. So, by episode's end, Sunspot's mother has let him be arrested by these official, I guess, representatives of wherever. Okay, once again, I don't know when I am and when I'm not supposed to take this show seriously. I will keep this very brief, but for the last 6 years, I have worked as a teacher, and of the many things I have learned during my time, there is no freaking way a mom is going to let her son be taken anywhere with these things that are threatening him. I can't tell a mom her son splattered paint on someone else and was restricted from using paint for the day without paragraphs of explanation. There is no possibility that this rich, powerful woman is going to allow these things to walk away with her son. Jubilee maybe. And hey, that might have made for a genuinely engaging scene. Crazy, I know. Sunspot's mother could have protected him, but given up Jubilee. You could have added dimension to her character and possibly even made a commentary on discrimination by having his mother be fine with Jubilee being a mutant, but not liking her due to her Asian heritage. There's a million ways you could go with this, but no, not this show. It is a 2-inch shallow pool all the way around. And we get close to the end. After pulling up outside the destroyed X-Mansion in his white car, even the car, Bastion finds out that Val Cooper released Magneto. He teleports to his base, making the car even more ridiculous. Was it a rental, an Uber?
Don't think about it.
So Bastion confronts Val Cooper, asking her why she let the dog out. And boy, this moment. Val recounts her experience in Genosha. We're shown her releasing Magneto. And then, this show about superheroes based on a children's cartoon from the 90s, has a character they are holding up as having made a moral choice, look down the barrel of the camera and say Magneto was right. At this moment, we are shown Magneto, still in his leather daddy underwear, flying up to the North Pole where he unleashes a massive worldwide EMP. In the next episode, the show will hand-wave this away as a few thousand deaths. Doing a few simple Google searches, though, yields the answer that in actuality, this would kill millions. It would cripple the world. Recovery to an attack like this would take about 5 to 10 years to even approach something like a normal world. And that's if the EMP functioned the way most power experts claim it would, and not knock out electromechanical power sources or independent generators. Except we're shown specifically that Magneto's EMP knocks out everything. So in one fell swoop, Magneto has committed an act of terrorism so extreme that it would be one of the greatest disasters humans have ever experienced. He has killed millions, crippled the world, and set back civilization. He is a terrorist now unlike any the world has ever known. He has absolutely proven the humans right in their fear of and need to control mutants. So what was this show's way of framing this moment? Did they condemn it? Did they show anyone reacting in fear and horror? No, of course not. This show had Val Cooper, a morally compromised character to be sure, but one that is being shown here to have now repented of her ways and made the correct moral decision. This character, the moral character in the conversation between she, Bastion, and Sinister, looks directly down the barrel of the camera again and uses the ironic slogan from Grant Morrison's new X-Men run, unironically stating, "Magneto was right." Translation: the world-killing supremacist terrorist who is about to carry out an act that will kill literally millions, that character is right. Why? Because bigots. Oh, man. Okay, we're going to have to dive into this more in a moment, but do I need to explain why this is such an insanely broken ideology? Never mind the lack of development and plot mechanics to get us here. Never mind all of the messaging in this episode about who the real bad guys are. No, we have arrived at the moment that this show has gone so far up its own ass that it is supporting a terrorist attack. Again, based on a children's cartoon about superheroes. Final scene. We cut to Morphin Wolverine saying that Magneto has just declared war, and that it would be good if the professor would get back, and I cannot make this up. I don't know what this show is. Charles Xavier, literally, Deus Ex Machinas, out of the sky right above them and crashes into the mansion. He of course says, "To me, my X-Men." I think this is supposed to be a triumphant moment. I think this is supposed to be the Gandalf the White returning level of triumph, coming back to you now at the turn of the tide. Except, well, that had dramatic impact and was built up. This is just, what is it again? Help me out here, Deadpool.
God, that's lazy writing.
Okay, let's get a few positives out of the way. First, I am not really a fan of any of the voice acting on the show. Even the legacy actors feel tired and sound off, but Theo James, as much as I dislike Bastion as a character, clearly understood the assignment and is giving very good voice work. He is excellent in Netflix's The Gentleman series, and here he is again proving that he is an underutilized actor with real ability. I just wish he had better writing to go with that talent. And of course, the Nightcrawler moment. There is no snarky follow-up to that. Fully giving it to the show, they made Nightcrawler and his entire character a standout. From his moments with Jean to his excellent action sequence, Nightcrawler is the one character I can point to as being excellently handled. And the negatives. Well, most of them I dealt with in the breakdown, so I won't rehash them here, beyond saying that the sheer amount of implausibility of Bastion's plan, the government backing it, the idea that his reach has extended all the way to Brazil with hundreds of these Sentinels already active. I know we're supposed to get the idea that Bastion has been building this plan for a while, but come on. This is the kind of ridiculous thing that makes trying to treat the show as in any way serious inherently ridiculous. Sunspot's mother just giving him up to the Sentinels, I guess? I think we're supposed to think she was a bigot, but honestly, she was so minimally characterized, and what we did see pointed to a woman who was business-minded, but not evil or in any way anti-mutant. Jean suddenly becoming an exposition machine, the entire reveal of who became Prime Sentinels, and really just Bastion's plan in general. Okay, let's get into Bastion's plan. I'm still struggling to understand the logic of it. So, create a mass terrorist event in a newly recognized UN country and mutant safe zone. Somehow, instead of sympathy, this creates anti-mutant hostility. This overloads the bandwidth of humanity and moves them out of apathy and into feeling like they have skin in the game, by thinking that mutants will go to war. In the comics, Bastion's plan came at the end of two massive events that had severely damaged humanity's tolerance. Fatal Attraction, and Magneto releasing the massive EMP that he does at the end of this episode, and the Onslaught arc, in which Onslaught wreaked massive destruction. So humans were desperate to gain back some control. So the US government tacitly agreed to Bastion's program to begin policing mutants. When he went too far, they arrested him. What is the US government's position on Bastion? Did the show forget Kelly exists? Is he okay with hundreds, thousands of humans being turned into Sentinel hybrids? What about the government of Brazil? Are they okay with this? Because it looks like Bastion is doing great with his program there. But of course, the show is not going to address any of that. Again, answer questions. Think about actual consequences of all this nonsense. No. And finally, let's get into the Magneto of it all. Why did Bastion keep Magneto alive? What was the goal there? Why Magneto in particular? Neither Master Mold nor Nimrod had any particular grievance against Magneto. Bastion has no history with him, so why not just kill him? I honestly thought after the end of episode 7 that Bastion was going to implant Magneto with some kind of hardware that he could use to control him and use him against the other X-Men. It would have been hackneyed, contrived plot mechanics that's been done a million times, but it would have at least given the character a reason to keep Magneto around. But the cold, mutant-hating, mutant-hunting fusion of human and machine decides to keep alive the one guy who can, in a second, wave a hand and obliterate him? Would it not have been the more cold, machine, logical villain way to simply kill Magneto when he had the chance? But no, for the simple reason that the former showrunner wanted to keep Magneto around so he could do the Fatal Attraction story, he had Bastion keep Magneto alive. And in a leather daddy bondage banana hammock and collar while he was strung up on the wall. Well done once again, Disney. And oh boy, Magneto. Let's dive into some lore here, shall we? If there's a single character I feel that this show has botched more than any other, it is Magneto. Magneto as a villain has existed in comics since literally the first X-Men story ever told in Uncanny X-Men #1 in September 1963. In his first appearance, Magneto is a pretty basic Silver Age dastardly villain. He wants to take over the launch of a massive missile and the X-Men stop him just in time. In his next appearance, Magneto would bring backup, his Brotherhood of Evil Mutants in X-Men Volume 1, number 4. He carried on being a pretty standard villain throughout the 60s and early 70s. Then, of course, Chris Claremont got a hold of the villain, and how did he view Magneto? As stated by Claremont, I started to wonder, why do people follow him? Started doing what any writer does with a character. I asked, who is he? Where did he come from? Why does he do the things he does? What is his rationale, his origin, his goal? I was having this dialogue with myself, or with Louise, about Magneto. How could we explain where he came from within the context of the X-Men? If he's the flip side of Charlie, is there something charismatic, noble, admirable about his desire to conquer the world? He had a cause, and I tried to figure out where that cause came from. Bearing in mind that I started writing in the 60s, most of the adult characters have been involved in World War II. So if Charles Xavier is a teenager during World War II and a line officer in Korea, Magneto's got to come out of the same era. If you're going to play with prejudice and racial conflict, the concentration camps immediately spring to mind. Once the dominoes set themselves up, I just started knocking them down. In Uncanny X-Men number 104, Chris Claremont would introduce the modern team of the X-Men to Magneto for the first time. It's a fairly straightforward, classic story where Magneto is a pretty basic, mustache-twirling villain still in his 60s form. Now, their next interaction in Uncanny X-Men number 12 is pretty basic again, except Claremont established that Wolverine is extremely worthless when matched up against Magneto, something Lobdell clearly knew, but decided to do anyway years later. But then we get Uncanny X-Men number 150, and this is the real turning point. This is where Claremont begins his Redemption of Magneto arc, by having the villain realize he's fighting and has almost killed a child in Kitty Pryde. This is the issue where Claremont made Magneto a Holocaust survivor and someone who had lost his family. Although up until Fatal Attractions, this is where Magneto carries out his most deplorable act and sinks a Russian submarine heading to his base. Magneto is raised an island base where he issues an ultimatum to the leaders of the world to engage in a nuclear disarmament or else. The Russian submarine Leningrad attacks the island firing missiles, but Magneto knocks down the missiles and sinks the sub, killing everyone on board and committing his most villainous act up until Fatal Attractions and the EMP. This continues up until Uncanny X-Men number 199. By this time, Magneto is living in the mansion, Xavier is very sick, and Magneto is becoming more involved with the X-Men. The issue is mainly focused on Magneto, who has taken Kitty Pryde to a Holocaust memorial. At this event, he is confronted by Mystique and the other former members of the Brotherhood of Mutants who are intent on arresting him. After a small skirmish in which Magneto still ensures the safety of the civilians around him, he decides to submit to arrest and goes on trial in the following issue of number 200, where we officially begin his redemption arc, and following this issue, he has taken over as the leader of the New Mutants starting in New X-Men number 35. Magneto would continue as the leader of the New Mutants for several years. In X-Men vs. Avengers in 1987, although not written by Claremont, the story involves a direct reaction to the sinking of the Russian submarine back in Uncanny number 150. Soviet super soldiers are hunting down Magneto, leading to a conflict with the X-Men and the Avengers, who are trying to bring Magneto to trial in the appropriate way. Magneto is refusing to be put on trial not out of his own weakness of character or fear of repercussions, but because he is trying to avoid conflict between mutants and humans resurfacing. Magneto resists capture until he tries to use a device on Captain America that will strip Captain America of any prejudices he may be harboring that are influencing his decision to arrest Magneto. Only for Magneto to discover that Cap has no such feelings towards mutants and is judging Magneto as an individual based on his past actions. You hear that show? Cap can be at odds with the X-Men, but also be a man who respects and helps them when he can. And then we jump forward to X-Men number 3 and the death of Magneto. The last issue of Chris Claremont's 17-year run. After the events of the Inferno crossover and other various catastrophes that have been building within the teams throughout the late 80s, Claremont's original vision was explained in Amazing Wizards X-Men Special in 2003. As stated by Claremont, that was actually the whole goal of the Uncanny X-Men arc from number 200 in 1985 to number 300 in 1993. The whole point was that Charles dies in a fight with the Shadow King, and Magneto would end up running the school. Except, as we have previously gone through in prior episode and lore coverage, that isn't what happened. No, instead of that arc finishing, enter Jim Lee and Bob Harras. I won't continue to disparage Lee too much. Again, the man is the entire reason I began drawing as a kid. But good grief, did he screw up X-Men. All credit, but he and Harris together in a lot of ways crippled the brand. So Bob Harras, the supervising editor, as previously mentioned, wanted to get back to basics. He wanted the X-Men from the early 70s. He wanted Xavier leading the team, all the old members back from X-Factor merged with the fan favorites from the previous eras, and Claremont's plans for Gambit and Wolverine were scrubbed. And Lee began introducing his own villains while simultaneously killing off the old. Claremont's final issue was X-Men number 3, where a somewhat isolationist, unhinged Magneto has left behind Earth to find refuge on his own satellite habitat named Asteroid M. He is guarding a new crop of mutants named the Acolytes who are under his protection. There's some ridiculous plot mechanics involving half of the X-Men being captured and pitted against each other, but for the most part it works well as an endpoint for Claremont's take on Magneto. Fabian Cortez, one of the upstarts that Lee was pushing as a new breed of villain, is secretly amplifying Magneto's powers and making him unstable. The X-Men and Magneto battle until, due to Cortez's manipulation, Magneto collapses. The government fires a satellite plasma cannon at the asteroid and severely damages it. Cortez escapes. Magneto, in a last-ditch, heroic effort, disables the nuclear weapons Cortez had intended to fire back at the humans and start a war from engaging. And in a final act, as the X-Men escape, Magneto chooses to go down with his ship, telling Charles to keep fighting. It's not the perfect endpoint Claremont had originally intended, but it worked as a fine send-off for the epic villain. Except, of course, this was American comics in the 1990s, and no one is ever really dead. The Acolytes and Magneto would return under Scott Lobdell and Fabian Nicieza in the now famous Fatal Attractions arc, wherein Magneto returns, attacks the X-Men, turns Colossus to his cause, strips the metal from Wolverine's bones, and is lobotomized by Xavier. We'll get into that a bit more next week. But for now, it's mainly worth noting that Bob Harras, as mentioned in the previous episode review, was the editor running the show at this time. The two main writers he had working for him on the X-Books were Scott Lobdell and Fabian Nicieza. Harris mandated that Magneto return, and in his continuing push for a return to Silver Age status quos, pushed the writers to make Magneto as maniacal as possible during his run. So the Magneto that returns feels nothing like the Magneto who had gone through 15 years and over 150 monthly issues of character growth. Instead of being the leader that died nobly to allow the dream to continue, he is a threat-spouting lunatic who blames Xavier for everything under the sun that has happened to mutants. Again, we'll get to all of the ways that Fatal Attraction is not a particularly good story, despite what Comic Book Resources said a week ago when the new episodes dropped, and why adapting it was a bad decision in next week's review. The last comic's inspiration for Magneto, from a full third era crammed into these 9 episodes so far, is Grant Morrison's new X-Men run in 2001. I put off diving into that fully this week because, as stated at the outset, I had it wrong which era these showrunners were pulling from. But they were pulling from this run as well, so it's worth mentioning. As stated in my review of Episode 5, the decimation of Genosha was pulled directly from this run of stories, wherein Magneto was crippled following a prior arc where Wolverine stabbed him after his dastardly plan. Then a character named Zorn is saved by the X-Men, he's made a teacher at the mansion, and ends up being Magneto. And after he reveals himself, he goes crazy, he's abusing drugs, he murders hundreds of thousands in the city of New York, he turns on his own followers, he spouts insane villain babble, and is finally decapitated by Wolverine. So what did Morrison have to say on the subject? Well, this was Morrison's very controversial take on the Master of Magnetism. As stated by Morrison, the Planet X story was partially intended as a comment on the exhausted, circular narrative of the X-Men's ever-popular battle with Magneto, and by extension the equally cyclical nature of superhero franchise reinventions. I ended the book exactly where I came on board, with Logan killing Magneto again, as he had done at the end of Scott Lobdell's run. Evil never dies in comic book universes. It just keeps coming back. Imagine Hitler back for the 100th time to menace mankind. So in the way that something like Marvel Boy had that insistent teenage hard-on engine driving its rhythm, Planet X is steeped in an exhausted, world-weary, middle-aged ennui that spoke directly of both my own and Magneto's frustrations, disillusionment, and disconnection, as well as the endless everything is not enough frustrations of a certain segment of comics' aging readership. In hindsight, I think I overdid the world weary a little bit, but, my loved ones were dying all around me while I was working on those issues, so I'm entitled to a little stumble into misery land. Phantom X's line summed up my own cynicism at that moment, definitely, and seems justified by subsequent plot developments. In my opinion, there really shouldn't have been an actual Zorn. He had to be fake. That was the cruel point of him. And it should have been the genuine Magneto, frayed to the bare, stupid nerve, and schizoid conflicted as he was in Planet X, not just some imposter. There's loads of good stuff in Planet X, it's just that miasma of bleakness and futility which hovers over the whole thing. What people often forget, of course, is that Magneto, unlike the lovely Sir Ian McKellen, is a mad old terrorist twat. No matter how he justifies his stupid, brutal behavior, or how anyone else tries to justify it, in the end, he's just an old bastard with daft old ideas based on violence and coercion. I really wanted to make that clear at this time. So why is this relevant to the show? Well, in addition to the plot with Genosha, the show is literally using the phrase Morrison was mocking in his run. Magneto was right is meant to be an indictment of Magneto's whole philosophy, and the idea that the mad old terrorist works better as a martyr than an actual leader. But this show somehow completely misses that message. It also missed the point that Morrison was trying to make, which is the ridiculous cyclical threat that Magneto had become. He was no longer an interesting villain with an intriguing viewpoint and progression as a character. He was an aged pastiche of a bygone era whose hypocritical ideology of mutant supremacy was completely lost on himself. But hey, this show got to promote a terrorist, so there's that. So a lot gets made about the supposed inspiration for Magneto and Professor Xavier in the comparison to civil rights figures Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., respectively. However, Claremont has stated he felt that as an immigrant white man, making that comparison would have been presumptuous. So he actually based Magneto's arc off of real-world Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who was the former leader of the Zionist military group Irgun, which revolted against the British government in charge of what was then Palestine in 1944. The Irgun were classified as a terrorist group by the British government at the time, but Begin was later elected the Prime Minister of Israel in 1977 and would later win a Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating a peace treaty with Egypt in 1979. So again, Claremont's goal was to take the character through an arc where he began his life with noble goals, became extreme in his beliefs and leadership, rose to a position of extreme power, and became more centrist in his beliefs and a great leader capable of achieving peace. Lobdell, and more specifically Harris's idea, was to bring Magneto back to his old mustache-twisting villain ways from the 60s. And Morrison's was to make a meta-commentary on how ridiculous that interpretation of that version of the character and his motivations were, and how it was time to move on. Going back to those comics, when you compare the characterizations of Magneto, from issue 199 of Uncanny X-Men, which this show pulled from directly for episode 3, to the way he is presented in number 304 when he returns, which is pulled from directly for episode 9, it is night and day. In those old issues, Magneto is an urbane, charming man who is taking Kitty Pryde to a Holocaust survivor's benefit. When Mystique, who is using the government to her own ends, shows up and tries to arrest him, Magneto first saves all the civilians, getting them to safety. Second, only fights the former Brotherhood until he finds out where the woman Mystique was impersonating is, and that she is safe. And third, as soon as he has confirmed this woman's safety, he surrenders to ensure no more damage is done, and to account for his actions. Comparing this to the grandstanding, beyond cartoonish villain of the Lobdell era, apparently Harris made Lobdell rewrite the issue 4 times, pushing Magneto to be more and more unhinged, is not even fair. So what did this show do? Well, of course, it made a half-assed attempt at the redemption arc, immediately turned it around, and utilized an intentionally wrong slogan unironically to side with a mass-murdering terrorist version of the character. Oh, and on top of that, they added in him being a creepy sexual predator instead of an elder statesman and teacher who is guiding a young mutant like Kitty Pryde, who he shares a Jewish heritage with. Great job, show. I seriously can't understand how anyone watches this show and can ever claim it to be well written. The sad thing is, the redemption arc could have been the hook that made this show great. It really could have. I'll go into my own how it could have been pitch on the episode 9 review. For now, I will just say Magneto is the largest indication for how badly these writers botched this narrative, how little they understand the world of the X-Men, how much they want to cram this show with their own broken messaging, and of course how the X-Men have become such a sad, cut-and-paste allegory for any group that feels they can claim ownership of them. My position, dear viewer, is close to that stated by the immortal Tolkien, which goes like this. I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations, and always have done since I grew old and wary enough to detect its presence. I much prefer history, true or feigned, with its varied applicability to the thought and experience of readers. The X-Men have a rich and incredible comics history full of fantastic storylines and great character work. They have some of the most dynamic characters in fiction, and yes, I'm saying that broadly, with over 60 years of narrative in some cases. The fact that the writers of this show chose to do this with the X-Men is genuinely disheartening. From Bastion's ridiculous, barely veiled, male and pale as stale villain characterization to the clear intention to show one particular demographic as the bad guys, it's clear that these writers are far from what the X-Men, or the people who worked so hard on this animation, deserved. And, well, that's it for me this week. I'll have the episode 9 review up very shortly, as I was working on its script in tandem to this one, and that one just doesn't have as much to dig into. Although it is worth noting that I think they also failed at translating Fatal Attractions adequately for the show either. But anyway, until next time, click, lightly tap any of the buttons on the screen you'd like, any of the playlists, you get the drill. Until next time, I thank you for being here, I thank you for your time, and maximum effort.